Two different worlds, an unlikely love. Jack, a millionaire businessman, and Emily, a dedicated teacher, were about to unite their lives. But when secrets from the past emerge and prejudices threaten to separate them, they will need to fight to prove that love can overcome any barrier. Jack Morrison adjusted his Italian silk tie for the 10th time in front of the mirror in his luxurious New York City apartment. His hands, accustomed to closing multi-million-dollar deals with a simple handshake, trembled slightly as he arranged the small red velvet box in his jacket pocket. Inside it was not just a Cartier engagement ring, it was the symbol of a decision that would change his life forever. A few miles away, in a modest house in Queens, Emily Thompson finished setting the table for the most important dinner of her life. Her rough hands, marked by years of work as a public school teacher, arranged the family's finest cutlery, a set that her mother, Mrs. Sarah, kept only for special occasions. "Honey, are you sure this man will feel comfortable here, Mrs.?" Sarah asked for the third time, adjusting the embroidered tablecloth she had inherited from her own mother. "Our house is so simple compared to his world." Emily took a deep breath, trying to contain the anxiety growing in her chest. "Mom, Jack doesn't care about that. He's different from what you imagine." In the next room, her father, Mr. Robert, was finishing getting ready, mumbling incomprehensible words as he struggled with the buttons of the only dress shirt he owned. Her two brothers, Mike and Chris, were talking quietly on the porch, casting suspicious glances at the street through the gate. The love story between Emily and Jack had begun 6 months earlier, when she, as an educational coordinator, was invited to give a lecture on education at one of his companies. The casual encounter at the coffee break turned into a conversation that lasted for hours, and since then they had been inseparable. But tonight would be different. It would be the first time the two worlds would meet. The sound of the doorbell made everyone freeze for a moment. Emily ran to open the door, her heart beating so hard it seemed to want to escape from her chest. Jack was there, impeccable in his Italian suit, holding a bouquet of rare orchids and a bottle of what appeared to be very expensive wine. "Good evening," he said in perfect English, but with a slight accent that Emily found charming. The smile on his face was genuine, but his eyes revealed a mixture of anxiety and hope. Mr. Robert was the first to approach, his face a mask of seriousness. "So you're the man who's been dating my daughter?" The words came out harsher than necessary, making Emily blush with embarrassment. "Dad," she whispered in a tone of reprimand, but Jack maintained his composure. "Yes, sir, and I'm very grateful that you invited me to meet you." He extended his hand, which hung in the air for a few seconds, before Mr. Robert shook it with unnecessary force. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone headed to the living room. Mike and Chris, Emily's brothers, exchanged significant looks as they noticed the Patek Philippe watch on Jack's wrist, an accessory that probably cost more than both their cars combined. Mrs. Sarah tried to ease the mood by offering coffee before dinner. "It must be very different from what you're used to," she commented, her hands trembling slightly as she served the cup. "Please, just call me Jack," he responded kindly, "and any coffee served with love has a special flavor." The response was perfect, but somehow seemed to irritate Mr. Robert even more, who muttered something about rich people and their rehearsed phrases. Emily felt her heart tighten, torn between her love for her family and the man who had won her heart. During dinner, each question seemed like an interrogation. The brothers questioned his business, his intentions, his religion. Jack answered everything with patience and honesty, but it was evident that each response was received with skepticism. "And how much does that suit of yours cost?" Mike asked, bluntly, making Emily want to disappear with embarrassment. "Less than the value of a united family," Jack responded serenely, his eyes fixed on Mike's. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily watched helplessly as the man she loved faced the silent judgment of her family. She knew that Jack was much more than his bank account, much more than his important last name or his successful companies. He was the man who stopped to talk to the doorman every day, who made a point of knowing the name of each employee, who had tears in his eyes when he talked about the volunteer work he did in children's hospitals. The tension reached its peak when Chris started making jokes about Arab sheiks and their 1,000 wives, disguising prejudice with a forced smile. Emily saw the flash of pain in Jack's eyes, although his face remained impassive. It was at this moment that Mrs. Sarah, who had remained silent observing everything, stood up discreetly. She went to the kitchen and came back with a cup of mint tea, an old family recipe. She approached Jack and, as she handed him the cup, gently held his hand. "You know, young man," she said in a soft but firm voice, "in my experience, a man is known by the respect he shows, not by the money he has. And you have shown a lot of respect tonight." Mrs. Sarah's words hung in the air like a balm. For the first time since he arrived, Jack felt his shoulders relax. His eyes met Sarah's, and in them was a mutual understanding, a recognition that went beyond social and cultural differences. Mrs. Sarah's simple gesture began to slowly melt the ice that had formed. Mr. Roberts shifted in his chair, looking slightly uncomfortable with his previous behavior. The brothers exchanged glances, this time with a touch of shame. The silence that followed Mrs. Sarah's words was broken by the soft sound of the spoon against the cup as Jack drank his tea. The scent of mint filled the room, bringing with it memories of his own childhood in Dubai, when his grandmother prepared the same drink in moments of family tension. It was surprising how some gestures could transcend cultures and continents. "This tea reminds me a lot of my grandmother," Jack commented, his voice laden with genuine emotion. "She always said that a well-prepared cup of tea can build bridges between people." Mrs. Sarah smiled, recognizing in the young businessman's eyes something that others had not yet perceived, a simplicity that his financial success had not been able to erase. "Your grandmother seems to be a wise woman," she replied, sitting next to him with a naturalness that made Emily feel a pang of hope. However, tension still hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Mike and Chris continued to exchange skeptical glances, while Mr. Robert kept his arms crossed, a posture that Emily knew well. It was his way of building invisible walls. "And your parents, where are they?" Mr. Robert asked abruptly, as if looking for some flaw in Jack's story. "My father is still in Dubai, taking care of the family business," Jack replied calmly. "My mother," he paused, carefully choosing his words, "she left us a few years ago after a long illness." The mention of family loss caused a subtle change in Mr. Roberts' expression. For a brief moment, his mask of hostility faltered, revealing a flash of empathy that was quickly suppressed. "And what did your parents think when you said you were dating an American?" Chris intervened, his voice carrying a hint of provocation. Jack gently placed the cup on the table before answering. "My father always taught me that a person's character is not measured by nationality or bank account. When I told him about Emily, about her dedicated work in education, about her passion for transforming students' lives, he said I had found a true treasure." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. It was the first time she had heard about Jack's father's reaction. Her hand found his under the table, a discreet gesture that did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Sarah. "And do you intend to take her to Dubai?" Mr. Roberts' question sounded like an accusation. "Turn her into one of those women covered in jewels who do nothing all day?" "Dad," Emily protested, but Jack gently squeezed her hand, asking permission to respond. "Mr. Thompson, your biggest fear seems to be that I want to change your daughter," he began, maintaining a respectful tone. "But it was precisely because of who she is that I fell in love. Her dedication to work, her simplicity, her love for family. These are qualities that no jewel could replace." At this moment, Mike let out a sarcastic laugh. "Nice words, but how long until you get tired of this simple life? Until you realize that our family will never fit into your world of luxury?" "Mike!" Mrs. Sarah reprimanded, but her son continued. "No, Mom. Someone needs to tell the truth. Look at him. Look at this house. We're from worlds that are too different." The atmosphere in the room became even heavier. Emily felt her heart tighten, torn between loyalty to her family and love for Jack. She knew their worlds were different, but believed that love could build bridges over any chasm. Jack slowly stood up, his erect posture revealing years of refined education. For a moment, everyone thought he was going to leave, offended by Mike's harsh words. Instead, he walked to the simple bookshelf in the living room, where photos of the Thompson family were displayed. "So I see in these photos a united family," he said, carefully observing each image. "I see genuine smiles, sincere hugs, moments of genuine joy. This is something that no money can buy." His fingers stopped on a specific photo. Emily, still a child, smiling next to her brothers on a picnic day. "When I met your daughter," he continued, turning to Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, "I found someone who made me question everything I thought I knew about happiness. She taught me that the most valuable things in life have no price." Mrs. Sarah approached him, observing the same photo. "It was a special day," she commented with a nostalgic smile. "We didn't have much, but we were happy." "And that's exactly what I admire about your family," Jack replied. "The ability to find happiness in simple things, in shared moments, in love for each other." Mr. Roberts slowly uncrossed his arms, his face a mixture of contradictory emotions. It was evident that Jack's words had touched him, even though he was still struggling against his prejudices. Chris, who until then had maintained a hostile posture, seemed to reflect on something. "And what about your work? Will you continue living here in New York?" "Actually," Jack replied, sitting back down next to Emily, "I'm expanding my business here in the United States, not just because of Emily, but because I believe in this country's potential. In fact," he paused, as if considering whether he should continue, "I'm developing a project for free technical schools in underprivileged areas." This revelation caught everyone by surprise. Emily looked at him in astonishment. She didn't know about this project. Her heart filled with even more love as she realized that Jack not only respected her work in education, but also shared her passion for making a difference in people's lives. A different glint appeared in Mr. Roberts' eyes when he heard about the technical schools project. As a former factory worker who had struggled all his life to provide education for his children, that subject touched on a sensitive point in his history. "Technical schools?" he asked, leaning slightly forward in his chair. "What kind of courses do you plan to offer?" Jack noticed the sudden change in his future father-in-law's interest and felt a small victory. "We'll start with courses in industrial mechanics, electronics and programming," he explained, his face lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "The idea is to train young people for the current and future job market." "And why would a businessman of your level be interested in this?" Mike questioned, still suspicious, but his tone no longer carried the same hostility as before. "Because I believe that education is the greatest agent of social transformation," Jack replied, his eyes meeting Emily's. "And also because, well, I have a story that I've never told anyone here in the United States, not even Emily." Everyone in the room adjusted in their seats, curiosity momentarily overcoming reservations. Mrs. Sarah served more tea, creating a welcoming environment for the revelation that was about to come. "My grandfather," Jack began, his voice laden with emotion, "started as a teacher in a small town on the outskirts of Dubai. He taught math to underprivileged children, often in exchange for nothing. It was through education that he began to transform lives one by one." Emily held Jack's hand tighter, realizing she was about to learn an important part of the story of the man she loved. Over time, he got a business opportunity in the oil sector, and that's how our family began to prosper. But he never forgot his origins as a teacher. Before he passed away, he made me promise that no matter how much our family grew or prospered, I would always remember that a person's true value lies in what they do for others. Mr. Robert completely uncrossed his arms, his eyes fixed on Jack, with a new perspective. "And why did you choose the United States for this project?" "Besides the obvious," Jack smiled, looking lovingly at Emily, "it was here that I found people with the same passion for education that my grandfather had. When I met Emily and saw her work in public school, how she struggled to make a difference in each student's life, even with limited resources, it reminded me of the stories my grandfather used to tell." Chris, who until then had maintained a reserved posture, leaned forward. "And where do you plan to build the first school?" "Actually," Jack took a deep breath, "I was thinking of starting right here in Queens. There's an abandoned lot near the subway station that would be perfect, but—" He made a significant pause. "I would need someone who knows the local community well to help develop the project." Mr. Roberts' eyes widened slightly. As a community leader in the neighborhood for more than 2 decades, He knew exactly the lot Jack was referring to. It was a space that the community had dreamed for years of transforming into something useful for the neighborhood. "That lot," Mr. Robert began, hesitantly. "We've tried several times to get support from the city to do something there, but we always ran into bureaucracy and lack of resources. That's why I'd like to invite you to be one of the project's consultants," Jack said, surprising everyone. "Your experience as a community leader and your knowledge of local needs would be invaluable." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It was no longer laden with tension and distrust, but with surprise and possibilities. Mike and Chris exchanged glances, this time of reluctant admiration. Mrs. Sarah, who observed everything with her usual wisdom, noticed the contained tears in her husband's eyes. She knew that look well. It was the same one he had when he talked about his youthful dreams of doing something significant for the neighborhood that had welcomed him when he arrived from the countryside. "But I don't want you to interpret this as an attempt to buy your approval," Jack quickly added. "This project is something I've been planning for months, regardless of anything. Mr. Thompson's participation would be a privilege, but I completely understand if—" "I accept, Mr. Robert," interrupted him, his voice choked. "If you're really serious about this." "More serious than ever," Jack replied, extending his hand. This time, when their hands met, the handshake was different. There was no longer the unnecessary force from the beginning of the night. Just mutual respect between two men who, despite their differences, shared a common dream. Emily hugged Jack, marveling at the turn the night had taken. From a tense family introduction dinner, they had reached a moment of union that transcended continents. The 2 weeks that followed the engagement transformed the Thompson family's quiet routine into a joyful bustle. The house in Queens became the meeting point, not only for the family but for the entire neighborhood, which mobilized to help with the trip preparations. Mrs. Doris, who had appointed herself as the unofficial coordinator of the preparations, appeared every day with new information about Dubai that she found on the internet. "Did you know they have a mall there, with an indoor ski slope?" she commented excitedly during one of the afternoon teas that had become frequent. "Skiing isn't really our thing, Mrs. Doris," Mike joked, while helping Mrs. Sarah organize a list of necessary documents for the trip. "But I confess, I'm more interested in seeing the technology labs that Jack's father mentioned." The news of the trip had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and everyone wanted to contribute in some way. Mr. Joe from the bakery insisted on giving basic English lessons to Mrs. Sarah and Mr. Robert. Mrs. Linda, a retired geography teacher, appeared with maps and books about Arab culture. Even young Carlos from the internet cafe offered to help Mike and Chris research the region. Jack, who was now a constant presence in the house, observed everything with a mixture of joy and emotion. One afternoon, while helping Mr. Robert get his passport, he made a surprising discovery. "You've never had a passport before?" he asked, noticing the blank form. Mr. Robert was slightly embarrassed. "You know, son, when you're young, you dream of seeing the world. But then comes family responsibilities. Dreams end up stored in a drawer." "And now?" Jack asked softly. "Now?" Mr. Robert smiled, his eyes watery. "Now I feel like I'm fulfilling not only my dream but my father's dream too. He always said that one day our family would fly high." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Mrs. Sarah and Emily were making their own discoveries. During a video call with Fatima, Jack's grandmother was teaching them the recipe for a traditional Arabic sweet. "Mom, look at this," Emily laughed, translating Jack's instructions. "Grandma Fatima uses cinnamon in the dessert just like you. She says it's the secret to making people smile." "That's because cinnamon is the spice of love," Mrs. Sarah responded, surprising everyone by repeating the phrase in Arabic, a result of the secret lessons she'd been having with Jack. The surprise and joy on Fatima's face when she heard Mrs. Sarah speak in her language was a moment no one would forget. The two women, separated by thousands of miles and different cultures, laughed together like old friends. Ethan, who had initially been the most reserved about the whole situation, surprised the family by showing up one day with a special project. Using his computer skills, he had created a digital album with old photos of the neighborhood and family. "I thought we could show Jack's family how our history is similar to theirs," he explained, displaying the photos on his laptop. Look at this one, Dad. You with your carpentry students at the community center. It's not that different from Jack's grandfather teaching in Dubai. The photographs told a story of struggle, perseverance, and above all, love for education and community. There were photos of a young Mr. Thomas organizing events on the lot that would soon be transformed into the technical school. Images of Mrs. Sarah giving free tutoring lessons in the garage of their house. Records of Emily's first steps as a teacher. "I'm going to make a special presentation to show in Dubai," Ethan announced, "so they can see that even without all the money in the world, our family has always been rich in other things." Luke, who was helping his brother with the project, found a particularly significant photo. In it, a young Mr. Thomas held a small trophy surrounded by smiling teenagers. "Dad, what's this?" "Ah," Mr. Thomas smiled nostalgically. "That was our first robotics project in the neighborhood. We managed to come in third place at the city science fair, with all recycled parts, can you imagine? And now we're going to have a state-of-the-art robotics lab here," Luke reflected. "It's like the circle is closing." The Thomas house had been transformed into a real planning center. In the living room, maps of Dubai shared space with old photographs of Brookside. In the kitchen, Brazilian and Arabic recipes mixed, creating a delicious cultural fusion. In the boys' room, technology and engineering books were piled up next to tourist guides. One evening during dinner, Mrs. Wilson appeared breathless with a new discovery. "You won't believe it," she exclaimed, entering without knocking as was now her custom. "I discovered that in Dubai they have a social project just like what Mr. Thomas did here in the 80s. They call it Bridges to the Future." Jack, who was present, smiled knowingly. "Actually, Mrs. Wilson, it's not a coincidence. When I told my father about Mr. Thomas's work, he researched social projects from here and was inspired to create something similar there." The revelation caused a commotion at the table. Mr. Thomas, especially, was speechless to learn that his humble work in Brookside had inspired a project on the other side of the world. On the eve of the trip, the Thomas house was immersed in an atmosphere of dream and reality mixed. The suitcases, carefully packed and repacked several times by Mrs. Sarah, rested in the living room as tangible symbols of the adventure that was about to begin. "Are you sure we haven't forgotten anything?" Mrs. Sarah asked for the 10th time, consulting her meticulously organized list. Beside her, a small basket overflowed with packages of frozen cheese bread and tapioca cookies, her insistence on bringing a little piece of Brazil to Jack's family. "Mom," Emily smiled, hugging her affectionately, "you've checked everything at least 20 times. Everything is perfect." Mr. Thomas was sitting in his favorite armchair, absently leafing through an old photo album. His fingers stopped on a particular photo, him as a young man next to his own father, in front of the first workshop where he began giving carpentry classes to the neighborhood youth. "You know, daughter," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "your grandfather always said that knowledge is the only thing that no one can take away from us. He didn't have the opportunity to study, but he did everything so that I could learn a trade." Jack, who had just arrived for the final preparations, approached with interest. "And that's how your work with the community began?" "Yes," Mr. Thomas replied, a special gleam in his eyes. "When I managed to set up my first workshop, I promised myself that I would pass on everything I had learned. It wasn't much, but it was everything," Jack completed softly. "Just like my grandfather. Started with an improvised classroom in Dubai." Luke and Ethan entered the room carrying a mysterious package. "Look what we prepared," they announced, unwrapping a handmade banner that read, "Brookside, Dubai, Bridge of Dreams" in English and Arabic. "We want to take a photo with this in front of your grandfather's school," Ethan explained, "to show that distance is no barrier when you have the same dream." Mrs. Wilson, who as expected was present on the eve of the trip, sniffled emotionally. She had spent the afternoon helping Mrs. Sarah prepare snacks for the trip, insisting that food is the best way to make friends. "Oh, before I forget," she said, rummaging in her bag that was always full of surprises, "the neighborhood people prepared something for you to take." It was an album, but not an ordinary one. Each page contained messages and photos from the residents of Brookside. There were notes from Emily's students, from community center regulars, from local merchants. all expressing gratitude and hope for the future that was being built. "The community is like a big family," Mrs. Wilson explained, for the first time, without her usual gossip tone. "And now that family is growing, crossing oceans." At this moment, Jack's cell phone rang. It was a video call from his parents. On the screen, Abdullah and Fatima appeared smiling next to a table full of Arabic sweets. "We're preparing everything to receive you," Abdullah announced in his increasingly fluent English. "My mother spent the whole day in the kitchen making all the family's traditional sweets. And I spent the whole day tasting," Fatima joked in Arabic, making everyone laugh when Jack translated. "Oh, that reminds me." Mrs. Sarah ran to the kitchen and came back with a notebook. "Jack, can you show this to your grandmother? These are all the family recipes I wrote down to exchange with her." Fatima applauded delightedly when she saw the notebook through the screen, especially when she noticed that Mrs. Sarah had tried to write the recipe titles in Arabic, even with some adorable calligraphy errors. "Tomorrow," Abdullah said with an emotional smile, "our families will finally be together, not just to celebrate Jack and Emily's love, but to show the world that differences can build bridges, not walls." The night was advancing peacefully, but no one seemed willing to say goodbye. It was as if that moment carried a special magic, a preview of the meeting that was to come. Conversations flowed naturally, mixing words in English and Arabic, laughter and tears of emotion. At one point, Mr. Thomas asked for the floor. Standing in the center of the room, he looked different, taller, stronger, as if the years of struggles and postponed dreams had finally found their purpose. "Tomorrow," he began, his voice firm despite the emotion, "we're going to embark on a journey I never imagined taking. We're going to meet people who, until a few months ago, seemed to live in a completely different world from ours. But now I understand that they're not different worlds. They're parts of the same dream." He paused, looking at each face in the room, including those smiling through the cell phone screen. The dream of transforming lives through education. The dream of building bridges between people, cultures, countries. And especially, he smiled at Jack and Emily, the dream of seeing that true love knows no boundaries. The Dubai sun was shining on the horizon when the Thomas family got off the plane, their eyes marveling at the grandeur of the city rising before them. In the airport lobby, Abdullah, Fatima, and a small crowd of relatives waited anxiously, holding signs in English and Arabic. "Welcome to your second home," Abdullah exclaimed, opening his arms to receive the American family. His warm embrace instantly dispelled any remnants of formality or nervousness. Fatima went straight to Mrs. Sarah, and the two embraced as if they were old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. They didn't need words. The love for family and the joy of the moment transcended any language barrier. "Come," Abdullah invited after all the introductions were made. "I want to show you something special before we go home." The van that transported them left the modern center of Dubai, with its gleaming skyscrapers, and headed towards an older neighborhood of the city. They stopped in front of a simple but well-maintained building, with a small garden at the entrance. "This," Abdullah explained proudly, "was the first school my father built. It started with one room and a dream, just like the project you're starting in Brookside." Mr. Thomas got out of the vehicle as if he were entering a sacred place. His eyes scanned every detail of the building, recognizing in it the same spirit. That motivated his own community work. Luke and Ethan quickly unwrapped the banner they had brought, "Brookside, Dubai, Bridge of Dreams," and everyone positioned themselves for a historic photo. Two families, two cultures united by the same purpose. But the surprise doesn't end here, Abdullah smiled, guiding them inside the building. At the entrance, a photo exhibition caught everyone's attention. Side by side, images of Mr. Thomas's community work in Brookside and Abdullah's father in Dubai told parallel stories of dedication and love for education. "When Jack told me about your work, Mr. Thomas," Abdullah explained, "I realized that our fathers, even without ever having met, shared the same dream. This exhibition will remain permanently here, inspiring new generations." Mrs. Sarah, who was no longer trying to hold back tears, hugged Fatima when she saw a particularly touching photo. her young husband teaching carpentry next to an image of Abdullah's father giving math classes. The visit continued through the school, where they found modern classrooms that maintained traditional elements. In one of them, a bilingual plaque announced Thomas Room in honor of educators who transform lives. "This will be the first of many," Abdullah revealed. "Every new school we build, both here and in the United States, will have a space dedicated to the memory of those who started this journey." The day continued with a traditional lunch at the Al-Rahman house, where the families mixed naturally. Mrs. Sarah and Fatima exchanged recipes in the kitchen, with the help of a translation app and many affectionate gestures. Luke and Ethan chatted animatedly with Jack's cousins about technology and future projects. During the meal, served at a large table in the garden, Abdullah asked for everyone's attention for a special announcement. "Today we celebrate not only the union of Jack and Emily," he began, "but the birth of something bigger. Our technical schools project will be a partnership between the United States and the United Arab Emirates. Each school will have exchange programs, allowing students and teachers from both countries to share knowledge and experiences." The news was received with enthusiastic applause. Mr. Thomas especially seemed transformed. His eyes shone with the same intensity he had in his youth. "And there's more," Jack added, smiling at Emily. "The first class of the exchange program is already formed." To everyone's surprise, a group of young people entered the garden. They were students from Brookside selected for a special training program in Dubai. Among them was Mrs. Wilson's grandson, who could hardly believe the opportunity he was receiving. The afternoon turned into night, and the families remained united under the starry sky of Dubai. Fatima brought her traditional mint tea, while Mrs. Sarah served the cornbread she had learned to make in the hotel microwave. "You know," Emily said, observing the two families interacting as if they had always been one, "when we met at that coffee break, I never imagined that our love would build so many bridges." Jack hugged her lovingly. True love has that power. It not only unites two people, but transforms everyone around them. In the center of the garden, Mr. Thomas and Abdullah were talking animatedly about the next steps of the project, already planning the inauguration of the school in Brookside. Luke and Ethan were showing their cousins the digital album they had prepared, while the family children ran and played, oblivious to any cultural difference. The night was advancing serenely, lulled by a mixture of Arabic and American music. Suddenly Fatima asked for silence and, with Jack's help in translation, shared an ancient wisdom. When two families unite with love and purpose, there is no distance that cannot be overcome, no dream that cannot be realized. Today we are no longer Americans or Arabs. We are one family building a better future together. Under the starry sky of Dubai, as conversations flowed in English and Arabic, as laughter and music filled the air, a truth became clear. Love, when true, not only unites hearts, it builds bridges between worlds, transforms lives and realizes dreams that seemed impossible. And in Brookside, where it all began, a new story was about to be written. A story of love, education, and transformation, proving that the greatest distances can be overcome when hearts beat in the same rhythm. Dear listeners, we hope that Jack and Emily's story has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours. This narrative reminds us that true love has the power to transcend cultures, create bridges, and transform lives. To continue this journey of inspiring stories, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving tales. Find it by clicking on the link to your left. If this story warmed your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Also, share which city you're watching us from. Who knows, maybe the next story will be about your community. Every day we bring unique narratives that explore the complexity and beauty of life. Don't miss our upcoming content. We await your comments and see you next time.